And welcome, family and fellow peacemakers. It's good to see you all this morning. Thank you for taking part of this gift of today to spend together in our Bible study. As John mentioned, as we continue looking into our part, as much as is possible with us, to live at peace with all people. And as I was looking over comments from Wednesday night's class, as we finished up Trust in the Lord and Do Good, and I appreciate your comments. And as we do that, we finish up the first G of Glorify God. And remember that as we continue through the summer or each day that God gives us, that is our first mandate. Our first priority is to glorify God. And with that as the foundation, then how do we respond in every situation, every thought, every word, every action to His glory? So today we get to the second G of our 4 G's, which is get the log out of your own eye. And so as John mentioned in his prayer, we are getting down to brass tacks, emphasis on what do I need to do about me? How can God continue to transform me into the image of His Son? And as we think about this, realizing that getting the log out of my own eye is key, as Jesus talks in Matthew chapter 7. And I want to begin our scripture reading there and read the first 5 verses. This is still in the context of Jesus's what we call the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talks about peacemakers in chapter 5. And here he says, "Judge not, that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the same measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own? How can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck out of your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck out of your brother's eye." So thinking about this, and the first question asks, how does getting a log out of my eye help in a conflict with someone else? Any takers as we get started? Let me back up with another question. What does it mean to get the log out of my eye? What does that involve? You can answer either one.
Steve?
Yes, go ahead, Mary.
As far as how can it help, it makes you more humble when you go and speak to the person, because it helps to dampen any self-righteousness that you may have, realizing that you also have faults. And that effect on your attitude has its effect on the person that you're going to, because you want them to feel the love in you're going to them, not just plain condemnation.
Yes, that's a very good point. And as we try routinely to get the logs, and that terminology is used in the ESV version, log and speck. Different translations use different terms there, plank. But the idea is the same. But in general, as I try to see my own faults and let God help me overcome them, but in a specific conflict, as Mary mentioned, all right, let's see what my challenges are in this and go with a much more humble, much more gentle approach. So thank you, Mary. Any other thoughts?
Hey, Steve.
Yes.
I recall, and I'm not going to get it just right, so I hope John Christian forgives me. Excuse me. He mentioned a few classes ago. He talked about how our reality becomes distorted sometimes in these conflicts, and I think it would help with that as well, as I'm focusing on fixing my own situations and being aware of my own struggles. Then I'm going to be able to face a conflict with a closer version of reality, if that makes sense.
That's a very good point. Yes, it's easy for me to get caught up in, look what you've done to me, look how you hurt me, and it leads me to jumping to conclusions that are likely not the case. That I've seen situations where someone saw a facial expression from someone else and interpreted it in a very negative way, and I said, maybe their nose itched, or maybe they needed to scratch their chin, or something was caught in their eye. And we cannot assume that, because we are judging very unfairly. And I don't know what I don't know about your situation, about the person that I have this misunderstanding or conflict or offense, whatever the specific parameters are. And so I need to focus on what I need to do for me to help the situation. Thank you, Andy. Any other thoughts or observations?
Hey, Steve.
Yes.
It occurs to me that if there is really a serious issue with the brother that you need to address, it's really going to hurt your credibility if that other person can see that you're being hypocritical and have serious issues that you're not dealing with too.
Yes. Yeah, our approach has a whole lot to do with whether we're going to be received or rejected. So that's a very good point. Was that you, Logan? Thank you.
Hey, Steve.
Yeah.
I believe that, we have to be consistent in our judgment, and that also encourages us as well. It's the idea, we're all sinners. We all have our sins, our problems, and those logs in our eyes that we need to kind of get ours out of the way first, take care of ours, so we'll be more, perhaps like Mary said, more humble and sympathetic towards those who are in sin or having problems, whatever the case may be, and thus be able to make a righteous judgment here,
Is that your gum?
a righteous discernment.
Yes, very true. Thank you, John.
Spit it out. Yeah,
Go
hi.
ahead, Bev. Hello.
Go ahead.
Me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I'm thinking back to something that Ted always used to say, our brother Ted Brewer, and used this illustration a lot, that when you pointed one finger at somebody else, remember that there are three pointing back at yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that can cause you to stop and think, now, wait a minute, am I as bad as he is? Am I worse than he is? Or what's the problem here? And a lot of times it's my attitude.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good point. Cindy just handed me a sticky note for her point. Beginning our approach to the other person by acknowledge our own shortcomings will soften the blow. When I come in recognizing my own faults, so thank you, Cindy. When I come in recognizing my own faults, then it's much easier for someone else to hear, well, Steve doesn't think he's got everything figured out, which gets to be the case more and more as I allow God to help me take logs out of my own eye. Other comments.
Sometimes, I sometimes liken it to what the Alcoholic Anonymous people teach. They teach a person who's an alcoholic first has to admit they have a problem, that they are alcoholic,
Yes.
and thus start to see if they have a problem in the beginning and deal with that so they can help others.
Yes. I am Steve. I am flawed. I'm a sinner. And here's my story. And here's how we can be reconciled by working together. Thank you, John.
I have one, Steve.
Yes, go ahead.
I don't think it's a mistake, or I don't think that it's just happenstance that it specifies that you need to look at the log on your own versus the spec and who you're talking to, because normally when I notice things that I feel like I need to address to other people, it's not usually like, oh, well, this person is murdering people, so I better go let them know that that's not okay. Like, it's usually something very small that probably doesn't matter. And if I'm looking at the bigger problems that I have in my own life, I might realize that this isn't even an issue that I need to be addressing once I'm looking at myself.
Yes, that's a very good point. That often we are very minute in our criticism of others, but very gracious with ourselves. And that's the whole point. And another point that I don't believe any of us would draw from here, but others have in different settings, is that he's not telling us not to help, not to correct, not to instruct each other. He is just warning us, be careful how you do it and what your focus is. And as Mary and Bev said, what is your attitude in regard to this?
Hey, Steve.
Yes, go ahead.
I this is not my original thought. I can't remember who I stole this from, borrowed it from, but it's often true, and this goes with Austin's comment, is it's often true that when I look at situations, I always want mercy for myself, but I want judgment for others.
Mm-hmm.
When I realize that my own sin, when I'm focusing on that log in my eye, it forces, I want mercy, then maybe that puts me in the mindset of mercy and grace when I'm dealing with other people as well.
Yes, that's a powerful point. James refers to that in chapter 2. He says, do you want justice or do you want mercy? Starting in verse 11, he who has said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak, and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. I can't afford God's absolute judgment. I need his mercy and his grace. And I need to reflect that to others as we work through things, conflict, offenses together. Thank you, Andy. Appreciate that.
Steve,
Yes.
I think perhaps in context with the whole chapter, it is about making proper discernments. And of course, starting on that, like I implied before and others have implied, that discernment starts at home first with us. And
Right.
So.
Very good point. Thank you. Anything else?
Yeah, this is Todd.
Yeah, Todd, please.
I'm just thinking if you look at it the other way, if you've got this multitude of problems and you notice this person with seemingly no problems or very little, the speck versus the log, maybe I'd be going to them for help. I noticed that your problems seem to be in control, and I don't know how to put that together, but coming at it the other way, I just wonder if there's any value in that.
I think that's very valuable as we evaluate the situation. And that's going to take us to our next point in chapter 4. Is this really worth fighting over? So from Todd's comments, as I evaluate, do I really need to bring this up, or do I really need their help with what I'm dealing with? Because they don't seem to have those same type of problems, or as severe problems as I perceive it, than what I'm dealing with. So thank you very much. Appreciate that. Any other comments?
John Christian, I think, has a comment. Steve.
Yes, John, please.
John, we're not hearing you. You're unmuted, but you're really, really quiet.
Better?
Yes.
Okay. There was a point that the book made that in this section that before we move to the next one, I think might be helpful. And it asked the question, well, it made the suggestion that there are two types of self-faults that we might need to look at when we're doing this self-evaluation, when we're looking at this beam in our own eye.
Mm-hmm.
And the two things that it mentioned was, one, do I have an overly sensitive attitude? And the second one was, is it possible that I've contributed to the conflict by my own sinful behavior? And maybe I didn't start it, but maybe my response to what someone else started, helped to escalate the situation. So I think those are two really helpful questions. And going back to that first one of self-evaluation, I may have an overly sensitive attitude. I think that I see this a lot, like in my work environment and just in our culture in general. And it's a difficult topic, and I don't want to get us completely sidetracked here. I know you don't want to get completely sidetracked here, but there are all kinds of things that might cause me to be more sensitive to a particular issue than the common person on the street, someone else. And I think it's something that we don't evaluate ourselves carefully enough for, is what is there about this other person's activity or something they said or did that is striking a specific chord in me that is causing me to react to it? And there's some categories of things I'd just like to throw out, and then maybe move on from there. But for us to think about, one, in Gary Smalley's book on the DNA of relationships,
Mm-hmm.
a lot about having a fear dance that occurs. And a lot of our conflicts are based on, if we ask enough questions, we can find that I'm having a conflict with another person because there's something that is threatened in me. There's something that has been threatened, and it might be that they make me feel insignificant. It might be that that I'm afraid I'm going to lose something by their actions that is very important to me. There's different things that strikes a fear in us, and then we overreact because there's a core fear inside of us. Another category is that we may have some needs that are unmet. Sometimes we are looking for something to solve a problem within our own selves, and if someone seems to be getting in the way of me meeting that need, then I may attack, which is part of our will. And so anyway, do I have unmet needs, or do they have unmet needs?
Mm-hmm.
I'm stirring up something in them, but am I overly sensitive because of that? And then sometimes historical injuries, have a history, and I think this goes in with the whole conversation of the Black Lives Matter and all of the demonstrations and so forth that are going on now. If I have a history of being hurt, injured, treated poorly, over time, I become particularly sensitive to those.
Mm-hmm.
And I may, as you talked about earlier, I may assume someone's doing something that maybe they're not really doing. So again, these are self questions that we need to ask, am I being too sensitive? And at the same time, you can go the other direction and say, well, am I being too calloused? Am I not being sensitive enough to this other person's historical injuries or their unmet needs or fear dance? But anyway, the two big questions that brought up were being overly sensitive, and the other is evaluating my own sinful behavior and how that might be contributed to it. And to me, those were really thought-provoking concepts as I was considering, why this conflict is occurring and how I evaluate the beam in my own eye.
Yes, thank you, John. Those are powerful reminders of, why am I upset?
Mm-hmm.
Why has this conflict arisen? And how have I contributed to it, instead of focusing on what has the other person done? Yes, it's very interesting. In the book you referenced, DNA of Relationships by Gary Smalley, we all have core fears. an oversimplification, and he lists several things to help us define our own particular core fears. For men in general, it seems to be not being in control and to feeling like a failure. And whenever we feel that way, then it doesn't take much. When I feel like I'm a failure anyway, then almost any little thing you say that I can twist that direction is going to bring out hurt and pain in me. And in general, for women, it is a lack of feeling valued or heard or important or elevated. And so if we can just keep those general things in mind as we find out the more specifics, then how powerful is that for us to either avoid a conflict or to solve it quickly? So thank you, John. Appreciate that very much. Other thoughts along these lines of evaluating ourselves and the logs that may be in our own eyes? A couple of you have referenced, Austin, I think, was the first one, that as we move into chapter 4 in the Peacemaker, is this really worth fighting over? And let me ask the question, what is one of the best ways to, or an excellent way is the way I wrote it down on my sticky note, what is an excellent way to avoid conflict? And it may be too simple, or I may have worded it poorly. So if somebody doesn't get it in 5 seconds, I'm going to tell you the answer. Or at least what I thought it was.
Steve,
Yes, help me out.
this is Connie.
Go ahead, Connie, please.
Think of the other person first.
Yes. Think of the other person first. And as I do that, then I may decide this is not worth bringing up. So if I don't bring it up, then I've already resolved the conflict, as long as I am able to be at peace with myself with it and say, you know, this is, and this goes back to John's way of evaluating. Is this because of my sensitivity over a particular issue or something that has happened? And it's not worth mentioning. And so I think that is the key to evaluating. And let me be clear here, we're not talking about sin. We are talking about one of the illustrations in the book that the author used. He does some traveling, and when he gets home, he's been eating restaurant food all week long, and he just wants a good home-cooked meal. Well, his wife is tired of being home, helping keep the house going and taking care of the kids, and she wants to go out. And he said, don't you care that I just want a home-cooked meal? And she says, don't you appreciate how hard I've worked while you were gone? And so here is this really worth fighting over? And he says, well, do you realize in our budget that going out costs more money? And she said, do you realize you just bought a new laptop last month? And so on it can go. And so as a result, then, is this really worth fighting over, or what is truly important here? As I get the log out of my own eye to consider how you're feeling and how I might approach you.
Steve,
Yes.
it reminds me of what I heard a preacher say one time. He said sometimes we're picking at pimples rather than taking care of the cancer in a person.
Mm-hmm.
You know, matter of priorities. Just like you said, is this really worth fighting over? Is this person's real need, or is this something we perceive?
Yes. And most of you know my philosophy of catch them doing something right. If any time I approach you, it is because I've got something to nitpick at or to criticize, then you see me walk in your direction, you're either going to cringe or turn and go the other way. And that is no way. But if we see the benefits, if we see the character, if we see the effort of each other, catch each other doing something right, then when a conflict does come up, then we are both in a healthy place, both to listen and to respond. Other comments?
Hey, Steve.
Yes, Eric, go ahead.
One of the things that I've had to consider, even myself, in getting into discussions that lead to conflict, is what is your overall objective?
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, conflict, you know, it's inevitable. You're going to have some conflict, but there's an old adage that says, you know, you got to choose your battles. So, what is your overall objective? Is it to help? Because I see a lot of comments on Facebook, and I've probably made some myself. Are you just picking a fight? You know, because all of these comments, especially as I had to curtail my own political rhetoric, what good does it do? I mean, a lot of times we're very emotional, opinionated, and everything else on issues that, number one, we can't do anything about. I mean, I can't control what the people in Washington do. There's nothing that I can do to affect it by blabbing out on Facebook. So Eric, what is your objective? And a lot of time it is, when you are upset about something, you want other people to be upset. And what I've also found, and this is why I don't listen to talk radio anymore, is that negativity feeds on negativity. So once you start getting into this negative rhetoric, then you're going to find yourself feeding on it. And I've noticed that with myself, and I've noticed that with other people. You're bringing up things that you know, number one, that you're sensitive to, and you're bringing it up just to beat up the other person. And a lot of people, because they're upset with some particular person, that they can't get to that person. So what they do is they beat up other people that they think that they tied to that person. And that's kind of how Satan himself works. He can't do anything to God. So what does he do? He goes to those who follow God and he beats them up. And in so doing, you know, he hurts God, so to speak.
That's a very good point. That am I looking to help or to justify my position? Or I appreciated your last point that when I'm upset, anybody in the way is going to realize it because I'm going to let them know. And that is often not a very healthy way to approach, to definitely not a good way to resolve, because I am actually helping to create more conflict rather than resolve it. So thank you, Eric. Anything else on this particular point, Mary or Jerry?
Yeah. One of the things too, where you pointed out, we're not talking about sin, we're talking about areas of opinion, but we have to be careful that sometimes we hold our areas of opinion so strongly, we lose sight of the fact that it's an opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have to have an opinion about your opinion. And we try to push things that aren't a matter of sin, but we've lost sight that they aren't a matter of sin.
That's a very good point. Recently became aware of that in a situation. I was talking to someone, and yes, we get ourselves in this box and we justify and find validation. And then when somebody crosses over that, then, well, that must be wrong. And as Jerry and Steve and Jeff have been very open as to, one of the main reasons for our study this summer is because of a new building. And we now have building plans, thanks to Steve sending out, to take a look at, to critique, to pick apart if you choose to, or we can choose, is this really worth fighting over? Where this is placed or that is placed, or this classroom or the size of that one, or this entrance or that entrance, or is this really worth fighting for? And I can't wait. We're probably not going to get to them this morning. But when we get to Utica and Syntyche, when we get to talk about this, I'm going to call them E and S because I have trouble saying both of their names. But I tried to do my best at least once or twice. Euodia and Syntyche. But they were encouraged to be of the same mind in the Lord. And we want to look at what things that they might have done to accomplish that in our next study. But yes, Mary makes a very important point that have I elevated my opinions to almost the level of God's word or being right, and any other opinion is just unacceptable. So thank you so much.
Steve.
Yes, go ahead.
Josh Coleman.
Yeah, Josh.
Just quickly, in those matters of opinion, we also still need to be careful that we don't sin.
Yes.
That they lead to us sinning. They may not have started out in any way as sin, but our actions within that context can become sin.
Yes. The way that I approach them, the way that I value them, the way that I defend them. And Cindy just added the point, we can add in here opinions and traditions. We are doing things in a very untraditional way right now, but we are still coming together. We are still glorifying God, and we are singing. And so thinking about a variety of ways to accomplish what God wants us to do. And we are still part of one another. Even though we don't get to see each other very often. There's my 5-minute bell from my lovely timekeeper. But yes, Josh, we just, the way I value my opinion or your opinion can lead me to sin. So thank you very much. Anything else in this idea of, is this worth fighting over at this point?
Hey, Steve, just briefly, just some thoughts.
Yes, Stephen.
Articulate them correctly or not. I'm not sure if chapter 7's talking about sin or not talking about sin. I think that's been discussed a little bit, and I'm honestly having a difficult time following this morning, so please bear with me. But I see the problem of going to someone else and discussing it, their sin, if it's sin. That's the issue, that there's the attitude of presumption that God's going to overlook me, God's going to overlook my sin, and I'm going to go take care of this other person's sin or whatever. There is a psalm that talks about presumptuous sins. It's the same psalm that we get as the deer pants for the water. So if anyone wants to look at that, I think that's a big problem, is if we ever think God's going to overlook my sin in any case. And that's why that would always be the case, that we have to focus on our own sins first. And I don't think that leads to the idea that we have to be sinless before we can help someone else that's in sin, because there are sins that we're not even aware of. There's another psalm about that God would search us and seek us and help us to understand our own sins. And so I could take this and say, well, I'm not good enough to go help someone else because surely there's some sin in my life that I've not addressed. But I don't think that that's necessarily the case, because this would be sin that you're aware of, a log that's in your own eye. And so just making sure that we don't ever have the attitude of, one, I can't be useful because, gee, I'm just this sinner. But two, we don't overlook our own sins, because the ones that we're aware of, we're presuming that God would just overlook those. And I think if God's going to be with us as we try to help someone else, we simply have to be aware of our own sins, and we have to deal with those first.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think that's a lot of what get the log out of your own eye is referring to. You prompted me to Galatians chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. As has been mentioned by several this morning, our approach is key to a positive outcome for both of us involved in this interaction. And most importantly, me realizing my failings, my faults, my weaknesses, my temptations, and coming humbly and appreciating the other person's efforts in their service to God, that we can come to a reconciliation and help iron sharpen iron, as Proverbs talks about, as we walk together. Other thoughts? We have 2 more minutes. Jerry, please.
And going back to our core verse, if you will, in Matthew, I think part of the problem, or part of the recognition in this context, is whether we realize it or not, as far as the log, oftentimes when we see a problem in someone else, what we're actually seeing is a fault in ourselves. And we may or may not consciously recognize is a fault and is causing other problems. So when we see it in someone else, we recognize that it's something that does need to be addressed and can cause a whole host of other problems if they don't recognize and deal with it as well. So in a sense, we're attacking the wrong situation to begin with. And we tend to, again, as it already been alluded to in several cases, we tend to downplay how serious it is in ourselves. But subconsciously, we already recognize it is a much bigger problem and can lead to much bigger situations if it's not dealt with. And we're trying to, if you will, address it in someone else before it escalates to that problem. But if we recognize in others that oftentimes what we're seeing is a reflection of an error in our own life, then we can approach them in a way that will be mutually beneficial.
Yes, thank you very much, Jerry. I appreciate that. And as Cindy mentioned earlier, that if we go in saying, this is something that I struggle with, then that brings us together to working on this together for both of us. And thank you all for your participation this morning. Look pretty seriously at Philippians chapter 4, the entire context. I've taken some of it way out of context before, and looking at ENS together helps me put it back into perspective in this context of being peacemakers and reconciliation. Love you all so much. Thank you for our time together, and look forward to continue our worship in a few minutes. And I've got a fan, Carson Jones. So Carson, Steve out.